Dear participants, welcome to the 15th Sea Change webinar. This is the 5th webinar in the 2013 series, and it's a bit of a special one because it's the first time that we focus entirely on questions that we got from you. And normally we have a specialist who comes in to answer certain questions, who presents on a certain topic, and after that we have a Q&A. But in this case, we focus entirely on the questions that you have sent in beforehand, and therefore the webinar this time is titled Special M&E Q&A Session with the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. And having said that, Asif, thank you for having us. Perhaps you can give a little bit of an introduction what the SDPI does.
Sure. The Sustainable Development Policy Institute is a research think tank based in Islamabad in Pakistan. Started its journey in 1992, about 21 years ago. Mm-hmm. We started off as an environmental policy and climate change research institute. Since then, we've expanded to economic growth, social sector, governance, gender, and a number of other areas. The M&E function at SDPI is now a special standalone function that works along with our survey unit, and we now have a strong M&E team, and this webinar is part of their continual professional development.
Good to hear that. That's nice. I thank you for having us because it's interesting for us as well. It gave us the need to reflect on what we are doing with respect to M&E. And before I continue, I'll introduce myself. My name is Dennis Boers. I'm the team leader of Sea Change, and Sea Change is a community of practice on the monitoring and evaluation of climate change interventions. And as team leader, I manage the community of practice and the online knowledge platform on M&E for climate change interventions. In this session, I'll give a 5-minute introduction right now and a little bit of webinar logistics. And after that, I will take roughly 60 minutes for the Q&A session, answering the questions that have been sent in. And at times, I also want to hear from you what your thoughts are on the answers that I'm giving, and also a little bit of reflection from your M&E department. And I put the questions in 3 blocks, and after each block there is time to have a little moment of reflection.
Okay.
And let's start with the questions. The first block, I'll first go through all the questions so that we know what will be answered, and after that I'll get to the answer question per question. But the first block looks at some basics. First of all, why do we need monitoring and evaluation? What are the fundamentals of M&E? What are the main points to focus on during monitoring and evaluation? Which skills do we need to be a good M&E professional? And what are modern ways or methods of M&E? And the 6th one and the last one in this first block of getting the basics right would be, which type of questions do we need to ask in a survey while monitoring and evaluating? And if you look at these 6 questions, then you will understand that if you would put another person behind the microphone, you would probably get slightly different answers. So the answers that I give are not the only answers. There will be other answers to these questions as well. It are just the answers that I feel are appropriate to these questions asked. And having said that, I'm not completely familiar, of course, with the context in which these questions have arisen. So every now and then I might ask you as well to ask the person who came up with the question whether or not he wants to elaborate a little bit more on why this question came into existence.
Sure.
The second block, and I call that looking at sectors, because the first question is what is the most useful M&E technique for humanitarian projects? And the second question in that block, the 8th question in total, is what is the most useful M&E technique for research projects? The 9th question, what are the fundamentals of monitoring and evaluation in ICT projects? And the 10th and last question in this block is, what is the role of ICT in M&E? After that block, the last block is a little bit more specific. Question 11 is how to design a logical and systematic monitoring and evaluation system. And I have to say some of these questions could be trainings in themselves. If I have a question like this, I could basically develop a 3-day to a week training just on what steps to take to come to a M&E system development. But we'll try to give a little bit of an introduction here, and I hope that helps. Then the next question is a bit of a continual question, because it was a long one that I'm cutting up in pieces, which is how to gather and analyze qualitative and quantitative information and communicate this effectively. So I will look at the gathering of information, the analysis, and then the difference between qualitative and quantitative information. And last, I take back question 6, which is, which type of question do we need to ask in a survey while monitoring and evaluating? And I take that question back because I, at that point, want to see what your answer is on that question after having heard all the other 15 questions. So summarizing, we have 6 questions in the first block, which is the basics. Then we have 4 questions looking at sectors, and that's humanitarian, ICT and research. And then the third block is a bit more specific, looking at gathering of information, design of logic and systematic M&E system, data analysis and difference between qualitative and quantitative information. So this is a bit the introduction of these questions. And having said that, we'll start with the first question, which is, why do we need M&E? Well, the first step in setting up an M&E system is to define its purpose and scope. And at that point, you need to think very carefully, what are the main reasons that I'm setting up and implementing an M&E system? And who are my stakeholders in the development of such a system? So it is a question that you also need to ask yourself, what are the main reasons to set up and implement M&E? And there are different answers to that question. There isn't one good answer, and there isn't one answer that is the answer. It is a variety of reasons that you might have to set up an M&E system and to have a need for M&E. To provide information for project management is one reason. To create constant feedback to improve responsiveness, efficiency and effectiveness is another reason. To involve key stakeholders and beneficiaries in learning how to improve the implementation of a project. To ensure compliance with strategies and policies. And to manage resources properly, and in that sense also ensure compliance towards your donor. And to help improve performance and achieve results. And to inform external audiences, and most likely that is the donor, and also your beneficiaries, about the program's impact. In UNDP they say, to enhance organizational and development learning, that's the reason M&E is needed, to ensure informed decision making, to support substantive accountability, to build country capacity in each of these areas, and in M&E functions in general. So these are a few of the reasons why you would need M&E. I could see certain programs where you might say, I don't really see a need for M&E. If you have a private funder who gives you money to do a very specific task, then you might wonder, and you will only do that once, is there then really a reason to learn from that implementation? Maybe not. Is there another way to report towards the donor without M&E in such a circumstance? Maybe there is. But I don't think that there are a lot of circumstances in which you are in a situation that you're implementing a one-off project with money from a private funder who doesn't want any reporting. And even if that would be the case, then just purely for yourself, it's good to do some level of accountability and learning from what you are doing. So these are some of the reasons why we would need M&E. The second question was, what are the fundamentals of M&E? And I want to pick this picture, which I got from a IFAD report. And it basically shows the M&E system to the left, and above it, it shows the project strategy. And it basically explains what the fundamental is of M&E. And the fundamental of M&E is not just within M&E. It's also outside of M&E. There's no reason to develop an M&E system if you don't have a project. And a project quite often starts with a project strategy, a plan of what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve that. And based on that strategy, you will develop your operational plan and you will develop an M&E system for that implementation. What is in that M&E system can be slightly different, but there are a number of steps that you probably will go through in the development of an M&E system. And when you look at this, you see that there are quite a lot of feedback loops. And M&E in that sense is an iterative process with quite a number of feedback loops within the development of the M&E system, within the implementation of an M&E system, and with the evidence that you get out of your M&E. I don't know if I'm going too fast at the moment, or if there are any questions on the previous question or this one.
I think, Dennis, you're okay for speed, but if you would just give me a moment, I can ask around the room if anybody has any questions. If have any questions, feel free to speak up. मुझे बता दें, मैं आगे pass on कर दूँगा. Hey? I think everybody's okay right now.
Okay.
You can continue.
So this question, the second one, the fundamentals of M&E, that is of course a question that is hard to answer, because there are different ways of looking at the question. So that's why I'm asking as well if there are any questions, because when the question is what are the fundamentals of M&E, that's quite hard to find one particular answer to. I would say that this picture pretty much shows how the M&E system is embedded in a bigger picture of project strategy, operational plan, and then project outputs, outcomes and impacts with a feedback loop for improvements and learning. Having said that, this quite specifically looks at a project, and it could actually be that you're also doing the M&E of a policy, which might give a slightly different picture.
Sure.
The fundamentals of M&E, what are the 6 steps in designing an M&E system? So that part on the previous slide, to the left, developing the system, gathering, managing information, reflecting critically to improve action, and communicating, reporting results. Those 4 steps, how do you develop that system? The first step I already discussed in my first question, because the question there was, why do we need M&E? And the first thing you need to do if you develop an M&E system is to establish the purpose and scope of the system, because there's not much use of developing a system if you're not sure what you're going to do with it. So why do we need M&E, and how comprehensive should the system be? And that's a bit of a balance between how much do you want to spend on your M&E, what is the total value of your project, what is then the amount of money you have for your M&E part, and based on that you look at what is my data need, given the purpose of why I'm doing M&E. Then the second step would be identifying performance questions, your information needs and indicators. What do we need to know to monitor and evaluate the project in order to manage it well? The third would be planning, information gathering, and the organization of information. So how will you gather it and how will you organize it later on? And that depends a little bit on the need that you have for information as well. Fourth step would be planning critical reflection processes and events. How do you make sense of the information that you got? How will you analyze it? And how will you use it to make improvements? Fifth step would be planning for quality communication and reporting. How and to whom do we want to communicate? And what would you want to communicate of all the findings in terms of your activities, processes and outputs? And sixth and last, planning for the necessary conditions and capacities. What is needed to ensure that the M&E system actually works? What do you need? And it's not just financially, but it's also in capacity of people that you might need to work your M&E system. And that gets me to the third question. What are the main points to focus on during monitoring and evaluation? And the first point I would come up with after having talked with a few people who work in M&E is make sure M&E is properly budgeted and the necessary expertise is also allocated. Secondly, be realistic about the timeline of your M&E work. And third, make sure the project design is flexible enough to learn from M&E evidence. Unintentionally, M&E is often set up to fail during the initial project design because there is not an adequate budget for the M&E or insufficient time or expertise have been allocated to the M&E process. And that is something that you need to think of in the startup phase of the project already. If there is insufficient flexibility in the project design, then you can come up with findings from your M&E process. But if there is no flexibility to actually make changes to the project or the program, then there's very little use of having that evidence. Fourth point, what should have focus during M&E is create ownership within the organization, but also with external stakeholders and beneficiaries. A lot of people think that if something is participatory, that ownership will just come by itself, but that's unfortunately not the case, and that would only focus on ownership with external stakeholders. What you see quite often within the organization is that the project officers get a lot of M&E work on their desk, but they don't have the time allocated to do it, and they also don't know why they are doing it. They don't see the deeper reason, the purpose behind it. And if they don't see that, then you will see that they are not very passionate about the M&E part of their work. And if they're not, then you can wonder about the quality of the M&E work and data that they will provide on their projects. And that would improve if you manage to create ownership among your own staff for M&E in the organization. Point 5, engage stakeholders, promote buy-in and commitment and motivate action. Focus on results. Having said that, not just results, it is a bit of a balance to focus on results and focus on the process, how you got there. If you purely focus on the results, then it's hard to learn, because if you get good results, doesn't mean that you got there well. That doesn't mean that the process that you followed to get good results is a good process. So in that sense, you need to balance a focus on results and a focus on the process on getting there. Focus on sustainability of interventions. So what happens when the program is over? The question is, if you have good end results and you stop your intervention and the beneficiaries continue with the work, does it necessarily mean that a better program, results-wise, generates better sustainability or a higher level of ownership? Not necessarily. So you have to balance results against ownership, against longer-term sustainability of the project. And as I just said, M&E of process versus output, where the results are the output, and the process is probably equally, if not more important, to know how we did it, next to knowing what we just did. So make sure you focus on as much of the process as you do on output. Which gets me to the fourth question.
Dennis, if I could interrupt you here.
Yes, yes.
A couple of points that actually I would like you to dwell a little bit more on for our team. One, under question 2, you talked about indicators, and if you could talk about maybe specific examples of your work and sort of in indicator selection, sort of looking at what kind of performance questions and how that led to specific choices of indicators, because we often end up, when we're looking at M&E plans or projects, having very loud debates and arguments about what is a good indicator to capture which kind of question, performance indicators, or whether it's coming from a perception survey, or whether it's looking at efficiency or financial aspects, whether you can tell us maybe a couple of rules of thumb from your own practice regarding different kind of indicators for outputs and outcomes and processes, something along those lines?
Question 6 focuses on questions. Maybe we should pick up the discussion of indicators at that point.
Sure, okay.
But having said that, I don't really have rules of thumb of developing indicators, apart from the standard rules of thumb that they need to be smart, and that they they need to be timely, and they need to be adaptable to the situation, and they need to be measurable, and so I have the standard ideas of indicators, but indicators and the development of indicators always generates a lot of discussion. And I think that's good, because that's part of also creating your M&E system, and that's part of also creating ownership within your organization for that M&E system. So in that sense, it's not that if you give me a question, I can come up with the smartest indicator there. If you have a question, I'm very happy to brainstorm with you on some indicators and see what your M&E staff comes up with, and whether or not that would be considered a good indicator.
Well, maybe we can come up with a question for you in a little bit.
Okay.
Please continue.
Okay. Let me get to the next question, which is, which skills do we need for M&E? And when I read that question, the first thing I did, I went to AlertNet and ReliefWeb, and I went to look at the terms of reference for M&E positions, and I looked at what do they ask for, and I have to say that I was surprised how little they often ask for, opposed to what I would expect from an M&E professional. And as it turns out, it's very hard to put into words what are the skills that you need for M&E. And the first question is, what really are skills? An ability and capacity acquired through deliberate, systematic and sustained effort to smoothly and adaptively carry out complex activities or job functions. That's the definition of skills, which has some part of education and some parts of experience, and then it has some cognitive skills, it has some technical skills, and it probably will have some interpersonal skills. But apart from skills, there's also knowledge, and together you would call that competence. But even then, it's very hard to put into words what are really skills you would need for M&E. What I did, I looked at what people ask for the development of M&E frameworks and M&E systems, and then I thought of what kind of competence or skills you would need to do that. And the first that I came up with was a sound understanding of the elements of an M&E system and the steps needed to both develop and implement an M&E system. And that could be a skill that you have from experience, or that could be a skill through education. A second one would be a sound understanding of the time and resources needed in developing and implementing M&E systems, which is more a project management skill than it is a pure M&E skill. But I think M&E professionals are more and more project managers as well. Third, strong leadership skills to provide guidance to M&E team members, and also strong leadership skills towards other staff that are not directly within the management sphere, because M&E more and more is a interdisciplinary activity. So it's not just that you have an M&E team that runs into those projects and then starts to do their thing. It is that you have staff that is not part of your M&E team, and you have beneficiaries and stakeholders who will do M&E tasks, who you will in some way need to manage as well. Be transparent, objective and independent. I think objective and independent is very important for an M&E professional. Ensure and manage equal participation of stakeholders and develop ownership. Promote empowerment and make sure you include marginalized groups, and having a feel of whether or not there are actually marginalized groups when you are looking at the M&E. Create an atmosphere of capacity building and learning from evaluation, which makes you more of a knowledge broker than an M&E professional. Ensure accountability and promote responsibility, which is more of a finance accountability focus. So what you're seeing is that the M&E professional needs to have a sound technical background on M&E, but more than that, also a big variety of other skills that are not necessarily within the M&E sphere, which are on project management, which are on people skills, and which are on finance and accountability. Then number 9 is more a typical technical skill, proper statistical and analytical skills to compile and analyze data. And 10 is then more a communication skill again, strong report writing skills, taking into account different actors. So if you ask me which skills do we need for M&E, if I look at terms of references for M&E positions, it's very hard to identify skills. And the focus quite often is on education and on 10 years of experience, 5 years of experience, but that doesn't necessarily say which skills you need. Looking at the development of M&E systems and what kind of capacities would you need, I come to these 10 points. Which gets me to question 5, which was, what are modern ways and methods of monitoring and evaluation? And that is hard because are you asking what are trends in monitoring and evaluation, or are you asking what are new M&E methods? Those are two different questions, and I don't think that either one of the two answers would necessarily cover everything or help you in that sense. I have to say the first point would be that M&E is becoming a transdiscipline, which means that it's crossing more and more disciplinary boundaries to create more of a holistic approach. There is increased political intent and accountability, performance indicators and transparency. So what you see is that there are much more demands from donors towards accountability, and that there are new developments in performance and knowledge management, and that has broadened the range of activities that you see being carried out by evaluation departments. And that comes out of, for example, the Paris Declaration of Aid Effectiveness. Is that a modern M&E method necessarily? No, this is more a trend that I see in monitoring and evaluation. There's a growing interest on evaluation capacity building and skill development. There is a growing interest in results-based management and results-based M&E, driven by bigger multilateral organizations. There is a growing importance of impact evaluations, but at the same time there's a discussion on whether or not randomized control trials are still the gold standard in evaluation. There is more focus on evaluation of policies and strategies, where 2 decades ago the focus was really on programs and projects. There is a shift from small projects to national programs and policies, requiring a more systematic approach to evaluation. And apart from that, it also asks that information can be fed upstream and downstream, which means that small project evaluations need to be compatible with national programs and policies, and vice versa. There is more of a focus on utilization-focused M&E, which means that the information and evidence in itself is not that important, but the use of it is important. And you might wonder, what is the difference between having the information and having the use of the information? And that's quite a big difference. We have to get away from the idea that if you generate your report, that because there is a report it will be used. That's often not the case. So what you have to look at is that the M&E evidence that you get out of your M&E process actually is being utilized, and that utilization is more or less the yardstick, the measurement of success of your M&E system. And last, I would say you see more acceptance of qualitative methods. Which gets me to question 6. And that was, which type of questions do we need to ask in surveys while monitoring and evaluating? And that was a bit of a very open question. And the thing I could come up with was that you have open-ended questions and you have close-ended questions. And both of them have their specific focus, and both of them have their advantages and disadvantages. If I look at open-ended questions, then those are good for a full range of responses and to get a bit of a in-depth idea of the views that people have. It identifies issues that are very relevant to people, and it generates new ideas about topics. So if you're looking for new ideas, open-ended questions are the way forward. The downside is that it requires more time, thought, and communication skills. The data entry might be a bit more time consuming, and next to that the data analysis might be a bit more complicating. And next to that you will also get quite some answers that might not be all that relevant to the things you are looking at. If I then look at closed-ended questions, you can measure knowledge, attitudes and behaviors. And the advantage is that they're easy to code and analyze and present. And there's less evaluator bias and a high degree of anonymity. But it's harder to develop questions and response categories. You might force people into giving a certain answer that would not be the answer they would be giving if they had an open-ended possibility. It gives less depth and substance, and a downside is that respondents are unable to explain or qualify or clarify the answer. And for example, in this picture, you see a guy saying, "The way I feel is hard to quantify." And then the lady asks with the survey in her hand, "How hard on a scale of 1 to 10? And that is basically giving one of the downsides of close-ended questions. Last slide on types of questions and surveys. The first point would be concise and use simple and clear language. And that is the same for open as well as closed questions. Don't use technical terms or abbreviations or double negative or biased phrases. Make the questions concrete. Use mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories if you have closed questions. And use caution when asking personal questions. People might not want to answer very personal questions. And put questions into question group. Don't jump from one topic to the next and back. Don't put sensitive and personal questions at the beginning of a questionnaire, but somewhere halfway, where people got a bit used to the way you're asking your questions and might be a bit more willing to get into more sensitive and personal questions. And put questions in the order from most familiar to least familiar. And end with some easy questions to make people feel good about having filled out the questionnaire. Give a good introduction to the survey, add instructions on how to fill it out, and let someone review it. Do a pre-test or a pilot to survey with a small group and see whether or not the survey was easy to understand for that small group, and perhaps whether the answers are easy to make use of as well. And coming to the end of this sixth question, maybe go back to you and discuss the issues you wanted to discuss with respect to questions and indicators.
Sure, thank you, Dennis. That's been very useful. We have quick questions. We have one of our M&E team members, Fayaz, who has a question.
Mm-hmm.
So our M&E team member Fayaz Yassin has this question, and I have to admit that when we conducted a training of our M&E team a couple of months ago, mm-hmm. this came up a number of times. Mm-hmm. But in your description of skills for the M&E individual, for the M&E professional, number 6, this is under question 4. Point number 6 was promote empowerment and include marginalized groups. Mm-hmm. Currently, we're working on a program which has that as its outcome and goal, is to increase empowerment and include marginalized groups. It's one of the programs that SDPI is working on. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how is it the M&E professional's responsibility? It seems like that's the responsibility of an implementing side or a program side mm-hmm. person. In some ways, the question is, why is the M&E person expected to be concerned about this specific issue of inclusivity and trying to include marginalized groups in empowerment, when oftentimes that seems like a program target, a program outcome or impact?
But
do you have any thoughts on that, Dennis?
Yes, isn't it the M&E professional's task to view whether or not that output has been reached?
Sure, it is, yes.
And if you want to measure that, wouldn't it make sense to then ask marginalized groups whether they have been included?
I agree. I mean, it is. We've had this debate before, and I use the example of a program that isn't specifically about empowerment mm-hmm. and about including marginalized groups. And I suggested that it's the M&E professional's role now, maybe it wasn't 10 years ago, mm-hmm. to be concerned about that anyway, regardless of the nature of the program. Yeah. Because if you work in the development sector, then it's every development professional's mm-hmm. concern to be worried about those things.
It has to do with what is in the end the impact you want to have as an organization. What is your bigger goal as an organization? Is that towards certain Millennium Development Goals? Is that towards? I mean, every organization has like a big mission. The end of world poverty, the end of slavery, no child labor in the world. Big picture things. And looking at the world and looking at the Millennium Development Goals and looking at other bigger picture goals in the world and in humanitarian organizations, doesn't it make sense that it is everyone's task within an organization, not just program managers, not just M&E professionals, but even the driver to promote empowerment and include marginalized groups? to carry out that vision of the organization towards the bigger world. And if you have that vision as an organization, then you need to include it in your M&E, and then you need to include it in more elements than just in your project and in your M&E.
Thank you, Dennis. Okay, well, I obviously agree with Dennis, but if there are any disagreements...
The point is that I can only report some the objective regarding empowerment is not being better, not being done.
Yeah.
How about my capacity? I can empower people, or I can...
I think there's a... Sorry, Dennis, the question is, as an objective and independent field monitor, for example, or somebody who's going as an observer, to use observation as a tool for monitoring and evaluation data collection. In that capacity, as the sort of slightly aloof or distant observer, how can the monitoring officer impact empowerment and inclusiveness when it's just their job to observe and then report on whether empowerment is being affected, or whether inclusiveness is a part of the project's success or failure, or anything of that sort?
But part of his task is to measure whether or not the people have been reached that you wanted to reach. And if you want to reach rural inhabitants in a certain area, then if you then have a participatory M&E session and you only have elderly men there, then you know that you have an issue, because it won't be that if you want to reach all rural people participating, that there aren't any women or children there, or elderly women, or, you know. In that sense, you look at what is the population that I'm targeting here, and you want to make sure that those are also part of your M&E.
Fair enough, Dennis. We'll move on, and we'll keep having this debate here at SDPI, and I'm sure elsewhere as well.
But
any other?
Let me ask where the question comes from to not include. Why wouldn't you include marginalized groups or promote empowerment?
We would definitely be including the marginalized groups, and of course the project is about them. But how can I empower someone when my role is just being a silent observer and reporting?
Yeah.
About the project?
If I could sort of play the arbiter in this debate, I think the concern that Dennis, correct me if I'm mispresenting your position. I think Dennis's position and would also be my position is that empowerment and inclusiveness are two general development goals that even as M&E professionals you should keep in mind whenever you're monitoring or evaluating a program, whether empowerment and inclusiveness is a direct goal of that program or not. So if the goal is cash distribution, you should also be looking at it from the perspective of, is cash being distributed in a participative way, in an inclusive way. For example, in Pakistan we have a social security program called the Income Support Program. So as an evaluator, you need to be looking at whether poor women are also receiving benefits from that. You're not being asked to impact the program directly, but you're being asked to use that as a lens when you monitor and evaluate. And if that's a fair enough assertion there, Dennis? Is that
yes, completely in agreement with that. If your program would focus on village leaders only, then it would make sense to focus your M&E also only on village leaders. But if your program would focus on poverty alleviation in general, focusing on a population of a certain area, then you would want to include more people than just village leaders in your M&E.
Okay, yeah, thank you. We'll take one more question and then we'll move on to the next block. Trends and... थोड़ी ज़्यादा क्लैरिटी चाहिए इस पे. Okay. Okay. Couple of our Jimos.
Third-party evaluation that I'm running, using that,
सिर्फ हम जस्ट मॉनिटरिंग कर रहे होंगे या फिर उनके एज ए ऑब्जर्वर हम होंगे, तो उसमें तो रिपोर्ट्स वाला है
नहीं, इन्फोर्स करने को तो वो कहीं कह भी नहीं रहे हमें, मगर मैं ये क्वेश्चन पास ऑन कर देता हूँ. Dennis, the three different members of our M&E team have obviously been piqued by your point in the trends, in the new methods and trends section. On governance and accountability, this was number, sorry, yeah, on increased political intent in accountability, performance indicators and transparency. And they're curious, there are various questions coming up. Is an M&E professional expected to engage directly with politicians? I think that's a question about what does the word political mean.
Okay, yeah.
And also, to what extent do you think accountability, how do you mean that is an increasing part of M&E work? Could you expand on that statement a little bit?
Yeah. What I mean with it is not that M&E professionals will engage with policymakers or political leaders. What I mean is that you see the intent in donors to focus more on accountability, performance indicators and transparency, where in the past you would write your project proposal, you would get a bag of money, you would then go somewhere into the countryside, you would implement your project, and after that you would write a report and someone would stamp it off, and that would be it. And that's very black and white, I know. But these days they will monitor very strictly how you are using your resources. You will need your procurement guidelines, you will need a very clear implementation plan, you will need to report on the performance, not just at the end, but also during the project. You will need to be very clear at the beginning already about your indicators and very transparent about how you are reporting towards both beneficiaries and your donor. With that I mean that there is more intent from the side of donors to focus on accountability. And I think that's a good development because it means that there will not be that much investments anymore in projects that are just not worth pursuing. And having said that, I know if you look around you, you will probably find ample examples still of projects that shouldn't have been pursued. Having said that, I do think that you will find a higher level of efficiency in the use of funding towards getting certain output and outcome.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Let me just pass that along, and then we can move on to block 2. I think what Dennis is saying here is increase accountability of the M&D team and of the M&D professional and of the projects towards donors, and being asked to be more specific from the beginning about how you're using their resources, where you're spending them, clear targets and clear results, and therefore M&E needs to be molded and adjusted, the M&E function, towards that need. And the political bit, if I'm not mistaken,
increased accountability and transparency of the humanitarian organizations in itself.
Yeah. So, for example, greater accountability of DFID to the British Parliament, or greater accountability of USAID to Congress, is where the politics of it comes into it.
Yes.
Basically, the countries that are giving the funding are demanding more clear results, more clear understanding of how their money is being used. They're not going to just let us take their money, implement it, and then just send them a report. And so accountability, increased accountability from us, the users of donor money, to donors, and from donors to their benefactors in parliaments and congresses around the world. Dennis, thank you for responding to those questions and concerns. I think we can now move on to block 2.
Okay. What I also wanted to show was that after each block there is an overview of resources. Later on I will send around the PDF version of this presentation, and then all the links will be clickable. So all the information that I'm giving in the previous 6 questions are based on these resources, and there are 3 pages of resources for the first block. And having said that, and having answered a few questions, we will now move to the second block, which starts with the first question of the 7th block, which was, what is the most useful M&E technique for humanitarian projects? And first of all, there isn't one most useful M&E technique, given the wide variety of humanitarian projects out there. You can't just say like this is the most useful M&E technique. But what I would say is that more and more participatory monitoring and evaluation is becoming mainstream in humanitarian projects. Next to that, I would say mixed methods. Mixed methods, I mean methods that focus on a combination of quantitative and qualitative M&E. And it's not that much about what with respect to these M&E techniques, but it's more about how it's being measured. And if you look at post-disaster and emergency settings, I would say that one of the more and more used techniques these days would be real-time evaluations. So summing it up, I would say participatory M&E techniques are more and more used in humanitarian projects. Mixed method approaches combining qualitative quantitative methods. Real-time evaluations in post-disaster and emergency settings. M&E data collection methods commonly include observation, stakeholder analysis, in-depth interviews, focus group discussion, experiments, rapid appraisals, and survey methods. But having said that, looking at these data collection methods, there isn't anything new, and they're not very specific for humanitarian projects. Techniques often used include participatory evaluation, most significant change technique being a qualitative method, projective techniques, for example mind mapping, stakeholder and force field analysis. Force field analysis being a general tool for systematically analyzing the factors found in complex problems. So just to look at what are the restraining forces and what are the driving forces if you would develop a program. So these are some of the techniques, approaches that I thought of when thinking of M&E in humanitarian projects. Going to the next question, which was, what is the most useful M&E technique for research projects? And I thought it was a bit of a strange question, and I would like to rephrase it to what are seen as the most scientific M&E approaches. And if I look at what are the most scientific M&E approaches, I would say randomized controlled trials, specific type of scientific experiment, often seen as the gold standard. Yes?
Dennis, my apologies if I may interrupt you just for a second. We've had a perfectly scheduled power outage, which are commonplace here. And if you could just wait for a second, our sort of sound will be back in a second, and then we can restart again. Just wait for my signal, please.
Yep.
The on of the speakers on of. Apologies for that. I think you can continue now.
Okay. The question, what is the most useful M&E technique for research projects? And I would like to rephrase that into what are seen as the most scientific M&E approaches. And then I would say randomized controlled trials are seen as a very scientific approach. And next to that, impact evaluation, which makes use of randomized controlled trials, is seen as also a very scientific approach to M&E. Having said that, it doesn't answer the question what is the most useful M&E technique for research projects. And I wonder where the question came from.
Just a second, let me ask around. What are the most useful techniques for research? Is anybody research projects के लिए what are the most useful M&E techniques? This question came from one of our participants who has not been able to make it today.
Okay.
Unfortunately. So I'm not sure what the background of that is. I mean, personally, if I can interject, I've trained some of our staff before, and I've always wondered, and I've always said this to various program people, and they've often gotten annoyed with me because we often end up doing work in social sector, education, health policy, as opposed to medicine. And I've always said there is no such thing as a randomized control trial in that sector. At best, what we can do is what's called a quasi-experimental design. Yet clients always demand that we conduct RCTs because it's an in vogue thing. What are your thoughts about that?
It's a difficult one. I have to say that I don't have the level of experience to take a clear stance in favor or against RCTs. My issue when looking at RCTs is that it's very hard to isolate external factors. If you take a control group that's really nice, and you will probably see a difference, but is that difference really only because you didn't intervene in your control group? And that is very hard, especially in the humanitarian sector, where there are in a certain area 30, 40 humanitarian interventions going on at the same time, influencing the bigger context in which you're operating, not just influencing the villages. So to me, it's very hard to I think it's impossible to find a control group that's not in any way influenced. And to me, it's more and more about contribution than it is about attribution. And I know there are a lot of people who don't agree with me on that one.
Thank you, Dennis. I think that's a very interesting idea about contribution as opposed to attribution. Thanks. I think we can move on.
Okay.
If you're comfortable. Yeah.
Yep. The 9th question was, what are the M&E techniques? What are the fundamentals of monitoring and evaluation in ICT projects? And I have to be very honest that it is not my field of expertise, and this one was hard for me to answer. And I had a look around, and I would say a framework for the assessment of ICT pilot projects that I found of InfoDev was very useful. They also had a knowledge map of ICT in education. If you would focus on monitoring and evaluation of ICT projects specifically in education, then there's quite a lot to find. Also of UNESCO in Bangkok, who developed a number of publications towards the region. Very interesting and very useful material. And that's this link, which I'll also provide in the PDF of this presentation. So having said that, for me it's very hard to answer this question. I can't give a clear answer. I would say InfoDev, UNESCO Bangkok, and ICT for Development. That is an initiative of the World Bank, I think. Are the 3 initiatives, the 3 players that I would look at for more information on this question. Which gets me to the next one, which is What is the role of ICT in monitoring and evaluation? Which is a completely different question than the previous one, although it sounds very similar. I would say that ICT always has had a role in M&E. It's not something new. Data analysis already takes place for at least 15 years in statistical packages that of course have become much more advanced these days than they were 15 years ago. Previous paper surveys or observation sheets were coded and they were typed into a database system or into Excel for analysis in the past. And these days we mostly use online surveys or add our observations or the findings from an interview we do with people directly into our database through a laptop or a tablet. So that's a new development. But apart from assisting us in our M&E work, the use of ICT can also empower our beneficiaries by being able to directly monitor through SMS or other online services. So putting some points down, data collection through online surveys, one of the ways more and more to make use of ICT. Data analysis through statistics software packages, simple analysis in Excel. And it has to be said that these online surveys are getting also better and better in doing some level of analysis themselves. Creation of databases with findings of multiple programs and projects for meta-analysis. Data collection and monitoring with mobile phones, tablets, PDAs. For example, here in Pact in Cambodia, the office where I'm housed, they have an SMS system for monitoring RED Plus projects. So the villagers themselves monitor the forests, and if there are any breaches in illegal logging, they will give us that information by sending an SMS to a server, and that gives a whole log of issues that might arise with respect to illegal logging. So that's a way of monitoring a situation in a project by means of SMS technique by the beneficiaries themselves. Auto transcript software for interview recording and other use of ICT, though not really perfect, but getting better and better. Mapping techniques using GPS and GIS. Online databases with accurate statistical data on country and often subnational levels. Where in the past, 20 years ago, it was very hard to find data, and you had to go into a office of the local town government and go through books and books, or you had to go through the registration of the church. More and more you will find that this type of data is being digitized, and you will find it online. A lot of multilateral organizations are moving towards open data protocols, in which means that they share both evaluation findings and the underlying raw data sets. And I said SMS services for monitoring in agriculture, forestry and other natural resource management settings. But at the EES, the European Evaluation Society conference in Helsinki, I saw a very interesting use of SMS monitoring with election monitoring, just empowering the people in the street to monitor and report irregularities with their mobile phones by SMS service, which was an interesting way as well of monitoring in a project. It's maybe not a type of M&E you're thinking of at first, but it is a way of project monitoring. One thing to take into account is be aware of exclusion and don't raise expectations. This is generally true, I would say, but even more so with respect to people having access to ICT. Keep in mind that some of our beneficiaries don't know how to read and write, and let it be that they would be able to use a computer. So be aware that if you would use technology, you might actually also exclude certain marginalized groups. Harvesting data has become easier. but still only collect what you will use. It's no use to just collect data for the sake of collecting data, and that is getting easier and easier with modern ICT. And be careful with it, because you need to be able to do something with that data. And this is an interesting picture. Get all the information you can. We'll think of a use for it later, and that's sometimes a bit the way it goes, and you have to be careful about that. And having said that, this was the fourth and the last question of the second block. And also for this block, I made an overview of resources that will be accessible through PDF later on. And with that, I would like to ask, are there any questions on these 4 questions?
We had a request for a greater discussion on RCTs. I'm not sure whether that's something you would like to go into, or I see that you've put some resources in the list that we can review for that. Is there something? I mean, maybe a small brief about do's and don'ts and where you think RCTs are applicable and where they're not. Looking at it from M&E perspectives.
Yeah, I have to say that I don't have an experience or a background in the use of RCTs. I think RCTs have the specific applicability, which is not necessarily linked to a specific sector. I wouldn't say that you would use RCTs only in healthcare or in education or in climate change projects. But I would say that when you use RCTs, you do that with a certain research question in mind. Otherwise, you wouldn't use them. And you want to prove something, and you want to be able to aggregate that finding maybe a little more than you would normally do with your M&E. What do people over there think is the use of RCTs?
हाँ जी, आपने पूछा था ना सवाल, अब जवाब दें.
RCTs capture two sort of impact, before and after impact, and between two groups. Okay. Between two groups, and impact across the time. It captures two sort of impact. That's the idea of RCT, and noise control tolerance.
Well, we have a couple of statisticians and quantitative leaning people here who are obviously fond of training. Yes. Yeah, we've been discussing these and the usefulness of them. One of our colleagues, Ishan, said that, I mean, when you have to do pre-post comparisons and when you have to do try and use a comparison group in order to establish attribution, that's when RCTs are relevant. But like I said, as you mentioned actually, that oftentimes there are so many interventions going on in a particular area that finding pardon the use of maybe inappropriate language, but finding a clean control group that has not been exposed to another intervention might be quite difficult. I personally think there are other issues of self-selection and selection bias that go into it that muddy the water as well. So I think that's the view over here generally.
I think it comes down to that first question that you ask yourself when you're developing your M&E system, which is, what is the main reason that I'm setting up and implementing this M&E system? What am I going to do with that information? Who am I going to report this to, and what are they going to do with it? How is this information going to be of use? How is it going to be utilized? And then with RCTs, you have to ask yourself the question, does that then justify to invest $50,000 US into a bigger RCT M&E project. And that depends on the size of your total intervention. And it might be interesting to do it, I completely agree. But have a look at not just the idea that you have about RCTs, but also, do you really think that within the circumstances that you're going to do them, you really are going to get better quality data? And does that really matter towards the results that you will be reporting? Does that really add anything to the conclusions?
Thanks, Dennis. I think we're fine to move on to the next block right now.
Okay. In no way am I saying that I don't see a role for RCTs, but I do think they have a very specific role.
Agreed.
Yeah, and yeah, let's maybe leave it at that. So the next block, and the first question was how to design a logical and systematic monitoring and evaluation system. And I have to say, if you ask me how to design a logical, systematic M&E system, then I would end up with the logical framework approach. And that's not the only approach in any way, but it surely is a very useful approach, and that is being shown here in this overview. And I'm Atif.
Yeah, just give me a second.
I'm getting a bit of feedback from your speakers.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you fine. It was just that I heard myself a bit too much.
Oh, okay.
I still do actually.
I think we're good now. I hope.
Okay. So if you ask me how to design a logical and systematic monitoring and evaluation system, then I would say that the logical framework approach is a very effective analytical management tool when understood and applied well. And it provides a framework for structured thinking of goals and means and stakeholders. And I appreciate the approach, but you have to keep in mind that you still need to think about other elements like stakeholder analysis, economic and financial monitoring, and that it's not a one-tool-fits-all solution. I also would like to say that if you develop a log frame or a logic model, that it's not something that you develop at the start of the project to not touch anymore. It's something that you should be adjusting throughout the project. So I would say have a look at the use of the logical framework approach with respect to designing a logical and systematic monitoring and evaluation system, because it to me is a very logical approach, starting with inputs, resources dedicated to or consumed by the project, your activities, what you're doing or planning to do to fulfill the mission of the project or program. Then the outputs, direct outputs, the volume of work accomplished, the outcomes, benefits or changes for participants after the project activities, and then impact, the long-term consequences of the intervention. And that is impact, you really have to look at the bigger picture indicators, like Millennium Development Goal, how does it contribute to poverty alleviation. So I'm looking at really the bigger picture there. What is a fundamental change intended or unintended in of this project towards society or towards the system? So you have your planned work, that are your inputs and your activities, and then you have your intended results, and sometimes, unfortunately, also your unintended results. And yeah, as I said before, what most people forget is that assumptions change over time, and your activities might change as well. Don't hang on to a logical model that you develop as if it is something that you need to accomplish. If you're context changes, if your assumptions that you made changes, if you don't have the inputs anymore that you hoped for, or you have more inputs, then adjust that logic model and discuss that with your donor if it is a donor who asks you to develop your M&E system. The log frame, the logic model, is not just a tool for M&E, I would say, it's a tool for project management, and you should see it as that. And in Sea Change we make use of the log frame approach, and we use it as well for our M&E, and we make changes to it to see where we are in time. And I have a one-pager here, which is perhaps a bit bad to see on a small screen. Maybe you see it on the projector there a little bit better. But what you see is that you have a range of inputs to the left. Then you have 4 objectives, and this is where we are right now. And this was made 2 weeks ago. The green ones are objectives that we are on track with. Then the orange ones, or the rose ones, are the ones that might deviate, that we need to keep an eye on, and the orange ones are the ones that need our focus for the next project period. A thing that you need to keep in mind here is that it's not necessarily linear. It's not that all these objectives are being implemented, all these activities are being implemented in a linear way throughout the project lifetime. So things that are orange right now might be orange because they were not planned to be finished within the first 6 months, or actually in the first 6 months there were no activities linked to these objectives. But this is just an example to show you what is a logic model, how does it look. This is the one of Sea Change Community of Practice. A difficult part here is the outputs and the output indicators that you see after the activities, basically the third column. Those are quite easy to measure. If you then go further and you get to your outcomes, and one of the outcomes would be capacity development of our members and integration of climate change and M&E, then it becomes harder to actually measure whether or not that can be attributed towards sea change. I can say something about whether or not COP members are developing their capacity, and I will also be able to say something about whether or not climate change and M&E is more and more getting integrated, but it will be harder at that point to attribute it to sea change. What I can do is I can interview members and I can see whether or not sea change has contributed towards these outcomes. So that's what I said before, the difference between attribution and contribution. You might wonder what would happen if I would now take a group of 100 sea change members and I would then take a group of 100 other people who are working in the same type of field and are no sea change member. Would that make a good randomized control trial? Would I be able to say that the difference between the group that is not a sea change member and the difference of the group that is a member is then attributable to sea change? That might be a difficult one, because there are much more knowledge brokers and there are much more sources of information out there that could actually influence those other people as well. So it's very hard to formulate an RCT, a quasi-experiment in this one. Having said that, we're getting to the next question, which is a question that continues over various questions. It was how to gather and analyze quantitative and qualitative information and how to communicate it effectively. And I start with the first part of that question, which is how to gather. And the most simple way of dividing different ways of data gathering would be structured data collection and semi-structured data collection. Where structured data collection approaches require that all data is collected in exactly the same way. That's important for multi-site cluster evaluations, where you need to be able to compare your findings at different sites in order to draw conclusions about what works best. So when would you do structured data collection? You would do it if you want to be very precise. if you're working with a large sample of population, that you're very sure of what you wish to measure. You're clear about that. You want to make sure your results are quantitative, and you need to make comparisons across different sites or interventions. Then structured data collection would be a very good approach. Semi-structured data collection approaches are still systematic and follow general procedures, but data are not collected in exactly the same way every time. And these approaches are more open, more fluid. People can tell you what they want in their own way, and if you get certain answers, you might want to ask for more details because you're not following a rigid script. And you would use this to do some exploratory work in new development areas. If you are seeking understanding of themes or issues, anecdotes, stories, some more in-depth information, if you're not entirely sure what you wish to measure and you want to get more clarity on that, and if there's not a clear need to quantify all your information. So when looking at gathering data, I would say the first choice is between structured data collection and unstructured data collection. So the question continues. It says how to gather and analyze quantitative and qualitative information and communicate it effectively. And that gets me to the question of quantitative data, which would be surveys, pre-post tests, secondary statistical data, statistical analysis, but also some structured interviews and observations can produce quantitative data. The strength would be that you can generalize the findings, not always, but quite often. It's relatively easy to analyze. Data can be very consistent, precise and reliable, and data collection is usually very cost efficient. Limitations are that secondary data sometimes isn't available, or that accessing the data might be hard. It might be difficult to understand the context of the activities if you only have the quantitative data, and data might not be robust enough to explain complex issues. So having said that, the question was how to analyze quantitative and qualitative information. And I have to say, going into the analysis of quantitative data would be an entire training in itself. So I wouldn't want to elaborate too deeply on levels of analysis of quantitative data, if that's okay with you. I just want to pick the difference between the use of quantitative and qualitative data, which gets me to the next slide, which is qualitative data. Observations, interviews, focus groups, non-statistical methods. And the strengths are to complement and refine quantitative data, and that's why I said what are modern methods used, and I said mixed methods would be my preferred way forward, a mix of quantitative and qualitative data analysis and information, because it is not one or the other. The two sources of data have their own strengths and limitations, and combining the two makes the end result stronger. So strengths are that you will get more detailed information to explain complex issues, and you can use multiple methods for gathering data on sensitive subjects. Limitations are that you usually can't generalize to study populations or whole communities. It's more difficult at times to analyze because you can't fit it neatly in standard categories. And data collection is usually a bit more time consuming and costly. So having said that, qualitative data often can be quantified if you want to, but the question is if you really want to. I did a research that used for an important part qualitative data, and I did qualitative data analysis. There are actually packages that analyze interviews on, for example, word counts. How often are certain words used, and how do they group together between different people being interviewed. I have to say that that level of analysis that I did at that point didn't really add that much to the end conclusions. I would say that at that point the qualitative data in itself had enough strength. So then I found this interesting table about qualitative versus quantitative information and use. And what you see is you see quantitative indicators and qualitative indicators, and why would you use them in monitoring and why would you use them in evaluating? So it says quantitative indicators in monitoring, first level, second level result, that would be your output and your outcome. You would do that to track project outputs, monitor social processes, and that would be something that you would do continuously with annual or half-yearly reporting. When looking at evaluation, you would do quantitative indicators to track changes in impact indicators, for example, towards poverty, hunger, Millennium Development Goals. And you would do this as a baseline, as a midterm, and as a project completion evaluation. So what would be the use of qualitative indicators? You would use those to identify factors influencing the rate of progress and attitudes of all stakeholders. So your quantitative indicators would say whether or not there is progress, and your qualitative indicators would say a little bit more on what influenced the speed of progress. Looking at evaluation, qualitative indicators are used to explain the context and the perceptions of any impact indicators, and they are also used during baseline, midterm and project completion evaluation, but also during the project itself when they are needed. So I found this table of IFAD explaining the different use of quantitative and qualitative indicators in M&E, and I thought it was quite an interesting split that they made here. Then the last point of that question was, and how to communicate it effectively. And I have to say that we just recently did a webinar which was called Presenting Evaluation Findings and Evidence-Based Organizational Learning. And that webinar focused for 50 minutes on only how to communicate your M&E findings and how to learn from them. So I would like to point you towards that webinar for more information on how to communicate your M&E findings. And this was done by Glenn O'Neill, who gave some very interesting tips and ways forward. Which gets me back to the 6 questions, which was the type of questions and surveys. And I wanted to ask the participants, like, after listening through those 15 questions and answers, would you yourself have come up with certain questions that you would now include in surveys for your specific projects that you wouldn't be thinking of beforehand?
If you had been thinking of questions that you would have included in the surveys for your project's evaluations, after having had this discussion, are there any new ideas, thoughts that you have that you want to share with Dennis and the rest of the team? Any types of questions that you have in your mind? Any questions about surveys that you want Dennis to respond to? Anything? Nobody? Okay. I don't think anybody has had any major epiphany, Dennis.
Okay.
On the matter. But yeah, I think I've sort of put that in everybody's lap, and hopefully somebody can come up with something by the end of our discussion. And then I'll let you know.
This was the last question that I had, and also for this third block of questions, there is a resource overview attached. Only 1 page this time, because most of the useful resources were already attached to block 1 and 2. And here I also wanted to ask, are there any questions on these last 5-6 questions being answered?
Okay. कोई सवालात?
when consistent sometimes, or is it always good to go for both like quantitative and qualitative work, which will be one of these constraints for each other hand, but given that I conflicts need both the थोड़े से बड़े होते हैं कि do not go to scope किया जाता है.
Once again, and this in my experience, Dennis, is a long-running debate and question, and members of our team have raised it again, is that oftentimes the choice between either or both quantitative and or qualitative methods is sort of necessitated by the nature of the intervention, the nature of the program or the project being reviewed by the M&E team. Is there and I know you highlighted the IFAD matrix of where and when you would prefer. Is there still a function of preferences, leanings? I mean, for example, I tend to lean towards quantitative methods, and that's what I'm more comfortable in. So how do you deal with something like that? If your team is quant heavy, or if your team is qual heavy, how do you deal with that kind of bias or preferences?
Yeah. It really depends on the type of project you're looking at. I can understand that if you're doing an evaluation of a health campaign. Now let me take another example. If you do an evaluation of a schooling project, I can see that it can be very much quantitative. But at the same time, I could easily come up with a number of qualitative elements that you might want to put in there to improve future programs that would focus on the same part. It's hard if you have an educational program and you measure how many children are graduating or reaching a certain level by means of a test, then you have how many children enroll and how many children go out of the system and how many teachers you trained, then that's very quantitative. But it doesn't say anything about the perception that people have about the program, and there is room, I think, for the qualitative element. And maybe in some cases the use of quantitative methods and the use of, or the going deeper into what are people's perceptions, what are people's thoughts, might be luxury at times. I do understand that, but it might give you a richer picture of the output of your programs.
We have a follow-up question. Just give me a second. Okay, Dennis, this is more of a sort of program side, M&E side relationship question with regards to quantitative and qualitative questions and indicators. Oftentimes, my colleague Fayaz has asked that, or said that as you're designing surveys or questionnaires or picking indicators or designing indicators, you get a lot of input from program side or research side saying, well, we need you to include this in your survey, and we need you to include this question in your survey, and we want to know what's going on with this indicator or X or Y indicator. And oftentimes, I mean, in our experience, that can lead to a bit of a hodgepodge of a survey without clarity, because there can be conflict between the M&E side and program side about how to approach the same output or measure the same kind of outcome. often where this kind of situation emerges. Do you have any advice? Do you have any experiences of a similar nature that you can discuss, especially where the conflict is about using a quantitative measure versus qualitative measure for certain things?
I would say that if you develop a survey, you shouldn't start discussing what kind of questions you want in the survey. You should start discussing what you want to get out of the survey and what kind of use you have for the results. If you can't formulate the use for the results, then there's no use to start talking about questions that need to be put in a survey. I once needed to streamline a performance measurement system, and 3 regional coordinators came each with their 60 indicators, and I said we can't do this because it's just not possible measuring this. It's double, and why do you need those? And if you then start discussing the information need first, it turns out that you can basically skip 65 to 70% of the questions that people come up with. There needs to be a clear need for the information. There needs to be a use for the information. And if there isn't, then we shouldn't ask questions about it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments? Quantitative. One of my colleagues is providing an observation. He's saying that in his opinion, or from what he's seen so far, that monitoring, leaving aside evaluation, seems to focus more on qualitative information gathering and qualitative methods of gathering that information. Would you like to disabuse him of that view if you think he's incorrect, or?
I actually think he might have a point there actually. But then again, we use a mixed method on our project, on our site, and we ask people questions in semi-structured interviews with respect to how they use our website and why they became a member and things like that, and they elaborate on that. And we do this throughout the year, but it is evaluation. At the same time, we might use it in some reporting during the year, not just in the end of project report. But it is true that if you monitor, that you quite often measure, and that these measures need to be put in some kind of monthly reporting format. And because of that, a lot of the information that goes in there needs to be easy to digest, quickly to digest, and that quite often then gets to quantitative information. Having said that, we do like to add quotes and comments that we get from our ongoing evaluation interviews, and we do add those as well in our monthly reporting. So in that sense, yeah, I do see a point that during the project time you have a bit less time to put that information into your monthly reports, into your overviews. But if we would write a report on how to do M&E of a community of practice, then we would use quite a lot of qualitative results in that. If we would start writing about the outcome of our community towards an audience, if we would start publicizing on our M&E, then we would use more qualitative data in those publications to basically picture the context in which it takes place.
Thank you, Dennis. Any other questions? Dennis, I think we're at the end of our conversation. I see more enlightened faces. Thank you for your patience with our questions and our technical problems. Personally, it's been a very useful exercise for me. and a lot of useful tools that you've highlighted. We look forward to getting the PDF of the presentation. I think I will excitedly be clicking on all those links and getting that information. The feedback survey that you sent us has been distributed to everybody. My namesake Asif, who's been communicating with you, will get those filled out and then send that information on to you by tomorrow.
Thank you.
So I think we won't take any more of your time. Once again, thank you very much for taking your time out for us.
I would like to thank you as well and wish you good luck with your work at SDPI. It was for us as well a moment to reflect upon our work in being knowledge brokers of M&E, and it also gave us a little moment of reflection towards the knowledge that we are having and that we are sharing. So thank you very much for having us as well.
Thank you.